Cut that line. Medical excuses don't override HOA rules.
The cutters snapped through my power line while HOA President Patricia Caldwell stood in my driveway and watched. 3 seconds later, my wife's ventilator screamed and switched to emergency battery. Patricia didn't flinch. She opened her red HOA folder and said, "He was warned." I didn't argue, because I had warned her in writing. And when the sheriff read the work order she signed, we discovered Patricia had crossed a line far more dangerous than anyone in that HOA realized. 11 days earlier, none of this looked dangerous. It looked stupid. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 61, and I spent 35 years working around electrical systems before I retired. I left the trade 2 years earlier than I had planned because my wife Laura needed me home. Her health changed slowly at first. Doctor visits became specialist visits. Specialist visits became oxygen equipment, monitoring devices, backup batteries, and eventually a ventilator we both learned to treat like another member of the household. When somebody you love depends on a machine, electricity stops being something you take for granted. You learn battery times. You learn alarm tones. You learn which sound means check something, and which sound means move now. Most of all, you learn redundancy. So when Laura's doctors recommended additional equipment at home, I made sure our electrical setup was done properly. Permits, inspection, utility documentation, backup capacity. Nothing hidden, nothing improvised. The exterior conduit running down one side of our house wasn't beautiful. I'll give Patricia that. But it was safe, documented, and there for a reason. Most people in Brookstone Ridge never noticed it. Patricia Caldwell noticed everything. She had become HOA president 6 months earlier and had an unusual talent for turning personal preferences into official-sounding emergencies. She called it maintaining community consistency. The rest of us called it Saturday morning. That was when her white SUV usually crawled through the neighborhood while she looked for things that needed correcting. One morning, I was replacing a weather seal on my garage door when she stopped at the end of my driveway. She pointed toward the side of the house. "What is that?" "Electrical service equipment. It wasn't there during the last architectural review. It didn't need to be." She stared at the conduit. "It's visible from the street. So is my roof." She didn't smile. "This community has standards, Mr. Mercer." I could already tell she wasn't asking questions because she wanted answers. She wanted compliance. Then she said the sentence that started everything. "If that installation was never approved, you may be required to remove it." I looked directly at her. "That equipment supports medically necessary systems inside this house. Nobody from the HOA is touching it." Patricia closed her red folder. "We'll see what the rules say." The next afternoon, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Official compliance notice. I opened it at the kitchen table while Laura sat across from me. The violation was simple. Unapproved exterior utility modification. Visual noncompliance. Corrective action required. 10 days. Laura read it twice. They think the thing helping keep me safe is ugly? Apparently. She looked more concerned about me than the notice. Don't fight with them. I'm not going to. And I meant it. 35 years around electrical systems had taught me that noise and control are not the same thing. When something is wrong, you verify it. You document it. Then you deal with the actual problem. So I wrote Patricia a calm response. I explained that the equipment supported medically necessary systems inside the home. I told her it had been properly documented and inspected. I offered to provide the relevant records. and I asked the HOA to withdraw the violation. Her response came less than an hour later. Medical use does not automatically exempt an exterior modification from HOA architectural standards. Then came the part that mattered. Failure to correct the violation within 10 days may result in daily fines and further enforcement action. That was when I realized this was no longer a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding usually ends when the facts arrive. Patricia had received the facts. She just believed her authority mattered more. 2 days later, she came back. This time, a man wearing the shirt of a local property maintenance company stood beside her. Patricia stepped onto my driveway. "We're documenting the violation. You already have pictures. We need current ones." The contractor raised his phone toward the side of my house. I moved to the edge of the driveway. "You can photograph from the street. You're not entering the property." Patricia stared at me. "This is an enforcement inspection. This is private property. HOA rules give us inspection rights. Show me where." She paused. Then she did what people do when the answer isn't in their favor. She changed the subject. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I'm asking you to show me your authority." She tapped the red folder against her leg. "Medical circumstances do not give homeowners permission to ignore community standards." I kept my voice level. "This isn't about permission. It's electrical equipment. If you have a question, send it in writing. You have 7 days left." They left. But later, when I checked the camera footage, something bothered me. The contractor hadn't been photographing paint, landscaping, or anything architectural. He had focused on the meter location, the conduit, the service box, the route along the wall, electrical components. I looked up his company. They did landscaping, pressure washing, fence repair, and minor demolition. I couldn't find anything indicating they were electrical contractors. That was when I opened the cabinet in my office, where I kept 14 years of records on the house. I pulled out the permit, the inspection record, utility correspondence, the service documentation. Then I started another folder. On the tab I wrote HOA Power. I didn't send Patricia a long argument. I sent her documents. Then I wrote one clear paragraph. This service supports medically necessary equipment inside the residence. No HOA representative, contractor, or vendor is authorized to disconnect, alter, remove, or interfere with it. The following morning, instead of withdrawing the violation, Patricia added a $100 compliance fine to my account. The next day, another one appeared. I requested the exact HOA language she believed gave her authority over the electrical equipment. What came back was general language about exterior appearance, paint, fences, permanent structures, visible modifications. Nothing authorizing an HOA contractor to alter electrical service equipment. I printed everything. Dates, emails, fines, notices. Then I waited. On day 6, Laura called me from the living room. "Daniel?" Something in her voice made me stand immediately. "There are 2 men outside by the meter." I opened the camera feed. The same contractor was back. This time they had tools. I was outside before they reached the side of the house. "Stop there." The older contractor raised his hands. "We're with the HOA." "I know who you're with. We were told to assess removal." "Removal of what?" "The non-compliant line." "Who told you that?" "The work order came through management." "Do you have a copy?" "Not on me." "Then you're not touching anything." The younger worker had already put his tool bag down. I pointed at it. Pick that up. Less than a minute later, Patricia's white SUV turned onto the street. She parked at the curb and walked toward us, carrying the red folder. Why are you obstructing an authorized contractor? Authorized by whom? The HOA. Show me the board authorization. You don't get to demand internal documents. I do when someone is standing beside my electrical service with cutting tools. Her expression hardened. This has gone far enough. Agreed. I pointed toward the camera above the garage. Everything here is being recorded. Her eyes moved up to the camera. Only for a second. Then back to me. You have 4 days remaining. I didn't argue. Patricia told the contractors to leave. But as they walked toward their truck, the older man looked uncomfortable. Like he had finally realized this job might not be as simple as Patricia had made it sound. That night, I sent one final email. I copied the property manager. The subject line was simple. Final notice. Do not disconnect electrical service. The body was even clearer. The electrical service you have identified as an HOA violation supports medically necessary equipment used by my wife. Interference with this service could create an immediate medical emergency. No HOA representative or contractor has permission to touch it. I attached the documentation again. Then I sent it. Laura was sitting beside me. What happens now? They leave it alone. You sound very sure. I'm giving them every chance to be reasonable. 27 minutes later, my phone buzzed. Patricia had replied. One word. Received. No question about Laura. No withdrawal of the violation. No apology. Received. I printed the email and put it in the folder. Then, for the first time, I told Laura what I had been thinking. I don't trust her. Laura looked toward the hallway where part of her equipment was charging. What do? We make sure every backup is ready. That evening I checked the batteries. I checked the alarms. I checked the backup equipment. Then I checked all of it again. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. The fines continued, but the contractors didn't come back. I started to think Patricia had finally realized she was pushing too far. On the 4th morning, Laura asked me to pick up a prescription. I hesitated. She noticed. Daniel, I'm fine. I know. You'll be gone 20 minutes. I checked the battery indicators one more time. Then I grabbed my keys. At 10:31, I backed out of the driveway. At 10:38, Patricia's white SUV arrived. At 10:40, the contractor's truck pulled in behind her. At 10:42, my camera recorded Patricia pointing toward the side of my house. Cut that line. The older contractor hesitated. You sure this is the one? I'm sure. Then the cutters closed. Inside the house, Laura's ventilator alarm sounded immediately. The system switched to emergency battery. The backup worked, but backup power is exactly what the name says. It buys time. It doesn't give you permission to waste it. A second alarm sounded from the monitoring equipment. Laura tried to stay calm. Outside, my neighbor Elena Ruiz heard the alarm through an open window. Elena had been a nurse for almost 30 years. She knew Laura's situation, and she knew I wasn't home. She ran across the lawn. By the time she reached the front door, Laura was conscious, but frightened and trying to manage the equipment while the warning continued. Elena called 911. I was standing at the pharmacy counter when my phone rang. Elena. I answered. Daniel, get home. 4 words. That was all I needed. What happened? Someone cut the power equipment. Laura's on backup. EMS is coming. I don't remember leaving the pharmacy. I remember running. I remember throwing the prescription onto the passenger seat. I remember every red light feeling personal. And I remember knowing the batteries were working, while also knowing that nobody should ever have forced Laura to depend on them this way. When I turned onto our street, I saw the ambulance first, then the utility truck, then the sheriff's vehicle. Patricia was still there, still holding the red folder, still talking. The contractors stood beside their truck, and the cut section of service equipment was visible from the driveway. I parked badly and ran inside. Elena was beside Laura. The emergency team was checking her. I went straight to her. "I'm here." Laura grabbed my hand. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. Then one of the responders told me the words I needed to hear. "She's stable." Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. A utility supervisor appeared at the doorway. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yes. Can I talk to you outside?" His expression told me something had changed. His name was Marcus Reed. He walked me to the side of the house and pointed toward the cut. "Who authorized someone to interfere with this?" I looked toward Patricia. "She says the HOA did." Patricia immediately stepped closer. It was an unauthorized exterior installation. Marcus didn't even look at her. "I'm asking the homeowner." "I didn't authorize anyone." Marcus nodded. Then he turned toward the contractor. "Who gave you the job?" The older man swallowed. "We received a work order." "From who?" He looked at Patricia. The sheriff's deputy noticed. So did I. Patricia opened her folder. "This is a private community enforcement matter." The deputy looked toward the ambulance. "Ma'am, there's an emergency medical crew in his driveway. This is not just an HOA matter anymore." For the first time that day, Patricia stopped talking. Marcus asked the contractor to produce the work order. The man walked back to his truck. He returned with a printed sheet. Marcus read it. Then his eyes went to the bottom. "Who signed this?" Nobody answered. He turned the page slightly. I saw the signature. Patricia Caldwell, HOA President. The deputy looked at her. "Was there a board vote authorizing this?" Patricia answered quickly. "I have enforcement authority." That wasn't the question. She tightened her grip on the folder. Then the contractor spoke. "We were told it was a non-compliant exterior line. Nobody told us medical equipment was involved." Patricia immediately said, "Neither was I." I stared at her. I almost answered. Almost. Then I remembered the folder sitting in my office. The email. The timestamp. Her one-word reply. Received. So I kept quiet, because something else had just become more important. If Patricia personally signed that work order, had the board actually approved any of this? I got the answer that afternoon. The utility crew was still restoring the service when an HOA board member named Susan Bell called me. "Daniel, did Patricia tell you the board approved removing that line?" She repeatedly said the HOA authorized it. There was a pause. "We never voted to remove electrical equipment from your property." I sat down. "Did you vote to send that contractor?" "Not for this." That changed everything. Until then, Patricia had hidden behind the HOA, as if every decision she made came from some formal process. It hadn't. Susan told me Patricia had been handling what she called routine compliance corrections, without bringing each decision to the full board. Paint complaints, landscaping, mailboxes. Somewhere along the way, she had decided electrical service equipment belonged in the same category. Susan asked me to send her every notice and every email. I did, including the final warning, including Patricia's reply. 20 minutes later, Susan called again. She got this before she signed the work order? Yes. You're certain? I'm looking at the timestamps. The line went quiet. Then Susan said, "We're calling an emergency board meeting." I looked toward Laura. The utility crew had restored the service. The equipment had been tested. She was resting. And for the first time since Elena called me, the fear began turning into something else. Anger. Not the loud kind. The clean kind. The kind that wants every page in order. Every date exact. Every sentence preserved. Patricia had spent 11 days telling me I needed to comply. Now she was going to sit in front of her own board and explain why she hadn't. The emergency meeting happened 2 nights later. Every board member attended. The property manager was there. HOA counsel joined by video. Patricia sat at the front with her red folder. I brought mine. Mine was thicker. Susan opened the meeting without small talk. "Did you authorize the contractor to remove electrical equipment from the Mercer property?" Patricia folded her hands. "I authorized correction of a documented violation." "That isn't what I asked." Patricia's jaw tightened. "Yes. Did the board vote on it?" This fell within normal enforcement authority. Susan looked toward HOA counsel. Counsel said nothing. Patricia continued. The line was visible from the street. It had not received architectural approval. I had refused compliance. The HOA had an obligation to protect community standards. Same phrases. Same confidence. Then Susan asked one question. "Were you informed that the equipment supported a medical need?" Patricia shook her head. "No." Something in the room changed. Susan leaned forward. "You were never told?" "Not in any meaningful way." Patricia looked toward me. "Mr. Mercer made vague claims after receiving a valid violation notice. Homeowners say all kinds of things when they don't want to comply." I opened my folder. Patricia kept talking. She said nobody had clearly told her disconnecting the line might create an emergency. She said she would never knowingly interfere with medical equipment. Then she said the sentence that ended her argument. "If Mr. Mercer had clearly informed me, obviously I would have stopped the work." I pulled one page from the folder. Then I slid it across the table. "Would you read the highlighted paragraph?" Susan picked it up. She read silently first, then aloud. "The electrical service you have identified as an HOA violation supports medically necessary equipment used by my wife. Interference with this service could create an immediate medical emergency. No HOA representative or contractor has permission to touch it." Nobody moved. Susan looked at the date, then at Patricia. "This was sent 3 days before the work was performed." Patricia leaned forward. "I received dozens of emails." Susan looked back at the paper. "There's a reply." Patricia stopped moving. Susan read one word. "Received." The room went completely silent. Not dramatic silence. Real silence. The kind where nobody shifts in their seat because everyone understands that something has just become impossible to explain away. Patricia finally said, "That doesn't mean I understood the technical implications." I spoke for the first time. "You didn't have to understand the technical implications." She looked at me. "You only had to stop." The property manager placed another document on the table. The contractor work order. Patricia's signature was at the bottom. Approved after my medical warning. Then came screenshots from my camera. Her SUV arriving. The contractors arriving. The timestamp. Patricia standing in my driveway. The contractor also submitted a written statement confirming they had been told the line was an unauthorized exterior installation and had not been told about the medical warning. Patricia looked around the room. Nobody defended her. HOA counsel finally spoke. This matter needs to be preserved exactly as it exists now. No relevant records are to be deleted, changed, or destroyed. That was the moment Patricia understood the argument had stopped being about how my house looked from the road. The board suspended her enforcement authority that night pending formal review. My fines were frozen. The violation was withdrawn. Before the meeting ended, Susan asked Patricia to turn over the red folder. For 11 days, Patricia had carried that folder like proof she controlled the neighborhood. She placed it on the table without saying a word. The consequences after that were quieter. No dramatic arrest in the meeting. No federal agents, mostly paperwork. The contractor turned over its records. The board opened a formal review. The relevant insurers and attorneys requested documentation. I gave them exactly what I had. Dates, emails, footage, permits, nothing more, nothing less. Patricia resigned from the HOA board before the review was finished. The HOA changed its procedures. No board officer could independently authorize physical work involving a homeowner's electrical, gas, water, or other critical utility equipment. Medical accommodation notices could no longer sit inside ordinary compliance complaints. The neighborhood also created a voluntary emergency contact system for residents who relied on critical medical equipment. Several weeks later, I was in the garage checking one of Laura's replacement battery packs when she appeared in the doorway. She looked toward the side of the house. The repaired conduit was still visible from the street. Nobody had hidden it. Nobody had painted it. Nobody had sent another notice. Laura smiled. Still ugly? I looked at it. Beautiful. She laughed. And that was the part Patricia never understood. The line was never really about aesthetics. It wasn't about me proving I was smarter than an HOA president. It was about knowing where someone else's authority ends. Patricia believed a title, a red folder, and a set of community rules gave her permission to cross that boundary. They didn't. And in the end, I didn't have to shout to prove it. I didn't threaten her. I didn't touch her property. I didn't play games. I kept the permits. I saved the footage. I kept the email. One warning, one signature, one word. Received. Sometimes the loudest person in the room thinks silence means weakness. It doesn't. Sometimes silence just means someone is keeping records.